Login tags can be super helpful if you need to somehow hard code some login functionality via a plugin or a theme. And there are a number of different login tags. So let's start off taking a look at these tags and then talk more about how we could use them. The login tags break down as follows. We have WP login/out or login out, and this will change based on whether you are logged in or logged out, what it outputs. And then we have logout URL and login URL. These should make sense. These are going to link to the general WordPress logout and login functionalities. We also have WP login form, so if you wanted to put a login form in a specific place on your site, you could, as well as WP lost password URL and the WP register function. Now, in addition to all of these, which are template tags, we also have a conditional tag, which we will get into a little bit later in this section, but I wanted to bring up now because it could be really helpful in use with these others, and that is user logged in? This will return true if the user is logged in and false if the user is logged out. And the reason we want to know about this here is a lot of these tags do not automatically change based on whether a user is logged in or not, but they do make sense to display or not based on whether the user is logged in. So let's look at the documentation for this, and then I'll show you some quick examples in the code of how we could use some of these. Okay, so back in our complete list of template tags page, we are now looking at the next section of these, which are these here, which relate to the login and logout functionality, etc. So if we come into WP login out, we can see that it has a string for redirect, which is set to blank, and then it also has a Boolean of echo set to true. We see our description here tells us that it allows users to navigate to the login or logout page depending on whether they are currently logged in. So this is great. This is going to happen automatically and change dynamically based on whether they're logged in or out. So we see here that we could pass in an optional redirect value. So if we wanted them to log into a certain place when they logged in or out, or return to a certain page, we could do that, and I'll show you a little trick with that. And we also have an option of whether or not we want to echo this out. Remember, in some cases we just want to get the link or get whatever it is, save it as a variable, then use it elsewhere. So if we wanted to do that, we would set the last parameter to be false. So this is the major one. I'll show you how to code this out in a second. Let me just show you the other two related ones. We have logout URL and login URL. So if we pop these open, we'll see that the documentation is actually very similar. We could see that it has a redirect option to redirect them to a certain place once they log in, and then a force reauth. So let's see what that is. This is whether or not to force reauthorization even if a cookie is present. It's defaulted to false, so you could set that to true for maybe a little bit extra added security. And again, you could just see how these begin to work, and it will tell you, okay, this is going to return the URL, but it's not HTML encoded, so it's just going to give us the URL itself. Then we have WP logout URL. Notice this just has one parameter option, which is a redirect URL. So if we wanted to pass it something specific, when you logged out, it would take you to a certain page. Again, notice it is the logout URL. Note HTML encoded via this and this. So it's running through that, and it gives you the logout URL. So let's just take a quick pause here and look at some of these. We've got the login logout link, and I'm just going to do a quick hack job of throwing this in the code so that we could get an idea of what it looks like in action. Okay, so what I have in our starter files here is a very basic template. And we have an index.php file, a header, a footer, etc. But what I'm going to do is open up my sidebar, and I'm going to hard code in this WP login logout link. Now, I should mention at this point, this may not be necessarily the best practice or the best place to do this. I'm just trying to demo how you could use this in your theme. And one of the reasons it might not be the best option to use is that we are hard coding functionality for something that could potentially be used with a plugin or a widget. So notice that we have dynamic sidebar down here. This lets us control the sidebar via widgets. So if we're hard coding something into our theme, this may be something we want, it may not. But let's just take a look at how this works right now and how it looks. So what I have is my simple theme here. Notice now I'm seeing a button to, or a link to log in. I click on that, I come to my site. I log in, boom, there I am. Now if I come back to my site again, notice that it's updated to say log out, and when I click log out, I'm returned to this page. Now, this is not necessarily the ideal flow because when you log in, you may often want to be redirected right back to the page you're on. So I'm going to show you a little trick that you could do to pass in a redirect value, one of the parameters, so that you log back in and log out to the same page. So if we come back into our code here, one of the tricks we could do is simply pass getPermalink. And what that will do is get the value of the URL for the current page and then save it here as a parameter. Now notice if we said the permalink, it would try to display an HTML tag right here that is the link, and that is not what we want. So in this case, we want get. And this points out that pretty much anytime you want to call a function and pass it as a parameter inside of another function, which is what we're doing, we have this function here and we're passing it another function as a parameter, which is completely valid, but we usually almost always want to use the get underscore version of a template tag as opposed to the underscore version. So let's just take a look at that in action and see what happens. So now let's say I come onto my page and I click log in. I go ahead and I log into my site. And now notice I'm taken directly back to my page. Now when I log out, before I was taken to the log out page, but notice now I'm back on my page. So this is a nice little trick that if you are creating login, log out functionality, you might want to use getPermalink to help you redirect to the same page again after logging in or logging out. Now coming back to the last couple that we have here, we have register, lost password URL, and login form. Now I'm not going to show you all these. I'll show you login form real quick, and then at the end you could practice playing around with these other two to see how it goes for you. So here with login form, notice that we have an array being passed in, an array is here, of different arguments. So that means if we come down to arguments here, we could see that there are a bunch of different options. We could pass in whether or not we want it to be echoed, redirected, a form ID, a label username, a label for the password. All of these different values, we could pass in a whole lot of different things to customize how the form is displaying. So let's take a look at this basic setup, and then any other time you see an array of arguments, you could follow this same basic format to help you figure out how to display everything properly. So the first thing is that array was optional. So one thing we can do is we could just say WP login form and see what loads currently. So we could see if we come to our site now, notice it has this login form. There was a little bit of CSS added, and you may need to customize the default fields if you don't have any CSS for working with forms. But this should work properly. And if I go ahead and try to log in now, notice that it does log me in. However, it's still displaying here whether I'm logged in or logged out. So the first thing we might want to do is go ahead and just wrap this in a conditional tag. So if you are logged in, it no longer shows the form. So the first thing we could do is come up and say if is user logged in, and then enter if there. So we could write this in a bunch of separate PHP blocks, or we could open it up and write it as just one PHP block. But I'm going to leave it as is for now, because who knows if you might need some extra markup and other stuff in there. So if the user is logged in, then display it. So that's wrong. We want to say if the user is not logged in, go ahead and display the login form. And we can see now if they're logged in, it doesn't show, but when we log out, now there it is again. Now, the other thing I wanted to point out were using these arguments. We could see it works by default because this whole argument array is actually optional. However, let's look at how we could change a few things in here. So let's say, for example, label for the username and label for the password. Let's just go ahead and play with that. So what I would do in this case is set up a new array called args. And then I will end up passing those arguments into the WP login form here. So the values that we wanted to change were label username and label password. So we do label username, and let's say enter your username, and then label password. And let's just go ahead that we get these arguments. Let's just go ahead and test that we get these arguments. They are being passed in, and we now have a different username and password label being assigned. So we can see when we refresh our field now that notice this is changed and updated. So you have affected that. That is perfect. And then if you wanted to change anything else about that form, you would just go through and follow the exact same format. So let's see, we have redirect. Notice that the default is redirect back to the requested URL. So this is already doing this for us. We don't have to customize that. But any other value, if you want to put an ID form on the submit, if you want to change the value of the username, all of these things are possible. So I'm just showing you the format so that anytime you come up something that has an arguments, you would basically just list the arguments here in this fashion. So we have the actual what it is we want to change, this format of equal sign, greater than sign, and then the actual value you want to pass in. Notice that we have a comma here separating them, and then a semicolon after we create the whole array, and then that array is being passed in. So that's the general flow and what you should know about with the login form and just general template tags that accept arguments like this. Now, the last thing I'll mention in this section are that we have lost password URL, which is going to return the URL of if they lost their password, how to reset that, as well as a redirect option. And then we have our WP register, which is going to display a link to register a new user. So this can be helpful if you want to allow membership, and it is important to point out that in order for this to work, you would also have to enable membership on your site so that people can register. But if you ever need to hard code a link, and then we could see we could pass in stuff before or after it, so if you wanted to be a list item or a header, etc., and then by default it's going to echo out, but we can change this and just save the value that it returns otherwise. So this is all of our login form functions. At this point, again, I would encourage you to practice. We're going to do a more general practice overall with all of these general tags once we're done. But at this point, I would encourage you to just open up your practice theme and just start playing around with different ones. At this point, it doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to apply it to your site yet, your own project that you're doing in addition to the one we are. But go ahead and just try using each one of these to get an idea for how it works. And again, you might want to use is user logged in and set if else statements if you're using something like login URL or logout URL, something like that. So go ahead and play around with this. And then in the next section, next lesson, we will look at working with blog info.